Setting up your meeting. The bar is moving forward. Hey, we're good. Okay, so I'm going to start the countdown. And we're back. Welcome everybody to Zoom Back Camera, the online film forum for the Browning Cinema. And at the front, we have something we like to say, and I read it in order to get it correct. During these uncertain times that have moved us out of the physical Browning Cinema and into a virtual one. Oh, sorry. And I'll get it right now. Our thoughts are with those battling the virus, battling isolation, battling precarity, and battling the fear inherent to this moment. And alongside that, we want to extend our thanks and appreciation to first responders, medical professionals, grocers, public transit workers, childcare providers, and anyone else on the front lines. Zoom Back Camera is a very small thing to offer, but we hope these conversations about movies we love will buoy your day and continue the education, the fellowship, and the dialogue with which we like to bracket our films in the Browning Cinema. We do have a chat alongside tonight's discussion. Feel free to say hey, announce yourself, shake hands. And along with people saying, hey, we have with us today, Dr. Tarryn Chun. Hello, Tarryn, how are you?
Hello, Ricky. All pretty well, all things considered.
Here. Tarryn, tell us a little bit about what you do, your work, your research.
So I am an assistant professor in film, television, and theater at Notre Dame, and I research Chinese theater actually, and I dabble in film. So my being here tonight is more a love of cinema and a love of film rather than expertise exactly in the area, though I do teach some films. And I mostly work on the relationship between technology and theater in modern China. I also work on spectacle, both of which are, have their own sort of relevances to today's conversation. I'm finding that theater going online is suddenly incredibly topical and sort of tragically so, but finding it very heartening that people who make art are finding ways to share it through technology. And then my affinity for spectacle obviously shows through in the movie choice for tonight. It is nothing if not a visually stunning movie. So that's another thing that I'm very, very interested in my work.
And as we have been doing, we have guest curators like yourself, and they choose movies they love. And what's interesting about this film is that it is widely praised. It finds itself at the top of various international polls from film directors, critics. We'll get into why you love it, but why do you think this film has such broad and over now 2 decades, some lasting appeal?
I mean, I think there are a number of reasons. I think that one of the main reasons is that it is a beautiful film. It is one that is full of color and music and texture and amazing, stunning acting performances. And so it is just visually compelling. I also think that it's beautiful and nostalgic in a way that sort of invites us in as viewers and makes us feel as though we can partake in it, really sort of be in the feelings, the emotions of the characters, the world of the film. I think we'll talk more about how the film draws us in as we go through. And, I think there's also some ways in which it's very clever and how it deploys its aesthetics. So I think that it evokes things like the French New Wave without asking too much of us as viewers. We don't need to know specific references to be able to appreciate the film, but we can appreciate its style. Similarly, I think that it presents a somewhat exoticized image of Chinese culture, of Hong Kong as a setting, but not in a way that makes us feel guilty about taking pleasure in it. And so I think, there are a number of things. I also think the fact that the filmmaker is just a little bit self-conscious and self-referential also fits the mood of the age in which he's come to be known as such a brilliant auteur, the sort of like postmodern moment before the early 21st century moment. I think that really like resonated as a directorial style to storytelling.
And we like to also record the first time people saw these films. Do you have a memory or a recollection where you were, what you're doing when you first saw In the Mood for Love?
So I don't remember specifically, but I'm 99.
That fits. Kind of hazy memories.
Yes, I have this hazy memory. So I think that this was part of a Chinese, Hong Kongese, and Taiwanese film watching binge that I went on roughly between the years of 2006 and 2008 while I was living in Taiwan. And I was sort of trying to catch up on films that I hadn't seen, and sort of oddly watched it in a really similar circumstance to how I watched it this time. I was living alone. I was in, not government imposed isolation, but somewhat self imposed isolation in a dorm room in Taiwan. I was feeling kind of lonely and in need of the comfort of art and aesthetics. And so I think that was, and it was part of the sort of rash of films that I watched during that period of my life, sort of in between a lot of Ang Lee. And I remember seeing Lust, Caution in the theater actually shortly after this, which, has some kind of resonances with this film as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll hop into it. And when we do so, we get a really striking credit sequence, in part because the tone and look is very different from the rest of the film.
Mm-hmm.
And we get a very bold quote up front, as we're going to get at the end. How does this set the stage for you, or how did it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's an interesting move. I mean, it's not an uncommon one, but it's an interesting move to start a work of film with a literary reference or with text instead of image. And so I think that one of the things that sets up is that this film is somehow about writing and about emotions that are best captured maybe in poetry or words or in cinema that is poetic and literary in a sense. I also think that, like, so if we go to the quote itself, it's reads something, the translation in the film is, "It was a restless moment. She has kept her head lowered to give him a chance to come closer, but he could not for lack of courage. She turns and walks away." And I think that this moment of proximity really captures something that's essential about the film, the way that closeness creates these possibilities, some of which are fulfilled, some of which are unfulfilled, unrequited, and actually, this whole, in this world in which today we can't get close to people other than the ones that live in our households. For me, it's been my 1-year-old daughter being very clingy for the last couple of weeks. It makes me think a lot about also like what is lost when you don't have this proximity as the basis for happenstance. That there is something that is missing very acutely when we don't have these kind of possible moments in our lives.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that's set up for us, and we are plopped to an literally an interior level, but we're given an establishing moment, and that's Hong Kong 1962. What does that quickly evoke for you? Or
Yeah, I mean, we could probably do a whole history lesson on
yeah, this is a
Hong Kong
book. This is a
1962.
book. But
So quickly, Hong Kong 1962. So it's an era during which Hong Kong was under British control. It's an era during which it's leading up to the Cultural Revolution in the PRC, which is just next door. It's an era which the Cold War is dominating Asia as it was the rest of the world. And it also is really significant for Wong Kar-wai himself. So 1963 is the year that Wong Kar-wai moved to Hong Kong from Shanghai. He was 5 years old at the time. And so it's this layered reference where it's setting up a world, but it's also already right off the bat creating this kind of intertextual reference to the director's own life. So, again, reminding us that this is going to be about, it's going to have these moments of self-referentiality, and it's about not just the sort of general nostalgia, but someone's personal nostalgia for a particular moment in time, and nostalgia that is, lives on in the memories of somebody who was very young at the time, actually.
in our opening scene, in that world, we get a dinner party, and we just did a film, Soylent Green, with literally no prints in it. It's all solid fabrics. And here we get prints on prints on prints on prints on prints. How did, off the bat, color and fabric, particularly the floral fabrics, how did they read for you?
I love the way that they evoke textures. I mean, so you have these sort of parade of bright fabrics, and I'm sure that scholars have mapped the different, which characters are wearing which colors when. But we have, of course, this gendered contrast. We have the dark drab suits that most of the male characters wear versus the brighter colors that the women wear. We have the interior that's much more patterned and decorated versus the exterior alleyway, which is textured but sort of dark and shadowy. We have the ways in which they communicate something about character, but almost like wallpaper covering up as much as they're revealing. So you have the sense, I think, already of play acting and charade and putting on a character, being telegraphed by the fact that there's such a sense of costuming even from the first moment in these people's everyday lives.
Mhm. Yeah, even when they are like tailored and snug, it's still
Yes,
still something.
revealing, but not.
Right. And we have the characters moving in. Chow runs to the room. Um, and we get accidental commingling. There are various moments of people accidentally coming together or not purposely coming together. Um, and generally ineffective movers and like the worst. And as someone who worked through grad school, what was the worst move you ever made?
So the worst move I ever made actually was why it was the worst move I ever made is I was not present for this move. I left my two roommates and my then boyfriend, now husband, to move all of my stuff from our former apartment to our current one. And we were he was my boyfriend. He was not a member of the apartment household at that moment in time. He was just helping. So he had to move all of my stuff. And this involved not only lugging my book collection, which at that point was already substantial, but they also were trying to move a couch up one of those, twisty turny Boston staircases that does not accommodate a large comfy couch, and got it stuck and had to saw the back of the couch to get it on the corner and then reconstruct it once they got up. I wasn't there. I was in Taiwan. I was having a great time on my summer study abroad. But I heard it was a pretty horrendous move.
I think that was some other people's worst move ever too. But we quickly set up the I guess Pam would say the apartment plot.
Mhm.
And between the home, the work, the clothes, how do you approximate the class? What are they signaling for these people and how they're fitting within the societal structures in terms of class? Yeah.
Yeah, I think relatively solidly middle class. So we have the sense that everyone is working, both the husbands and both the wives are working. They're able to afford things like the radio, some home appliances, but yet both of these couples are renting rooms in other people's homes. This also tells us something about their transience, so that they are, they're not buying a home, they're not there to stay necessarily, they're sort of in the middle. And this, I think, goes back to the question about the context of Hong Kong in 1962. So it's a time when we have still a certain number of emigres from mainland China. In this case, they're supposed to be from Shanghai. And Hong Kong wasn't necessarily the end point. It was often a stopping point on the way to other destinations. And we see that this is, in fact, the case. So it speaks to a kind of mobility that comes with a certain level, a certain type of socioeconomic class, but it also speaks to, I think, beyond that, more the mood of transience that all of the characters are feeling, even as they are in this otherwise quite domestic setting, which
Mhm.
normally we would associate with a kind of permanence, I think.
That's fascinating to read throughout the rest of the film too, as various bus stop moments. And we get, so we have some card playing, some smoking, some relaxing within the space and socializing. And this is where we become aware of the two minds that are in the soundtrack. There's the 1962 of the moment, Nat King Cole, Cuba-inspired album that's playing, along with a soundtrack that was written for the film that has, I think of it as like a Thomas Crown kind of vibe, like turn of the screw kind of vibe. Thoughts on how those either either elements of those like push the plot or give us mood, which is pretty heavy here?
Yeah, I mean, the music is so interesting throughout this film. I think that uh, one of the main things it's doing is linking to what kind of nostalgia is being evoked throughout the film. And so we have the instrumental track, which feels a little bit timeless, but maybe also helps confuse the time in that way. So making us feel these links to a kind of bygone Shanghai era, even as we're set in 1960s Hong Kong. Whereas the Nat King Cole, the 1962, I mean, it's much more specific to the time period. And the American influence, I think, relates to, or so I have read, relates to the fact that Hong Kong was also kind of an R&R stop for American soldiers at the time. And so the presence, you would think of it as potentially dominated more by British culture, but because American soldiers were often sojourning in Hong Kong, there's quite a lot of American culture coming into, and of course it's becoming a more and more international city as the 20th century goes on. And so again, I think it's evoking this texture of lives intersecting and paths and cultures crossing and moving around one another, that's mirrored then in the way that the characters sort of intersect and come apart and pass each other through their daily lives, at some points meeting, some points breaking apart, sometimes not even knowing that they're in contact with one another.
And we're about to set up the workspace, but do have a question from the chat. Can you briefly explain the living structure? I don't know if you can give a blueprint, but there's a lot of families, there's a common kitchen, other common spaces. Would this be a standard setup at the time, do you happen to know, or this kind of living arrangement?
So I don't know enough about Hong Kong 1960s architecture to say that with a lot of certainty, but this idea of the sort of like some shared common spaces and like families really living on top of each other, I think was relatively common again during this sort of period too, where people are moving around a lot. And so the sort of like temporary letting of a room in another family's space seems like not uncommon to me, but I don't know enough about 1960s Hong Kong to say for sure.
Sure.
I think again, but another thing too, it's like back to the nostalgia thing, it's also evoking a mode of living in Shanghai that dates back several decades before this sort of idea of like these houses that were shared amongst several families, maybe one living on each level. It's a trope that you see a lot in literature and plays and films that are set in Shanghai of like the 1930s. So I think that's another sense in which it may be both accurate to the time in which the film is set, but also evoking, like blurrally evoking this other era that the characters have connections to.
Yeah. And as a movie I first saw when I was in college, it was extremely evocative of like dorm living. So although our common rooms, I think, were never that neat, or never had that many flowers in them. But we do then we head to work, and Chan's husband goes and offers handbags as, in some ways, compensation for him being gone. There's a token there, but we get Chan and Chow at work, and a lot of parallels are set up. Both are in subordinate positions, both seem to be very autonomous about their work. And we get them then intersecting with Suen and Ping, who offer truce in their own ways. As the characters who are sitting outside of the relationships, we have two. We have the spouses, but then Suen and Ping. Feelings on those two, the comic relief that they add, the narrative thrust that they give. Did you like those folks?
So I don't like Swin very much, but I do like Ping, who
Okay.
incidentally is listed as also the props person in IMDb, which he shows up, the actor shows up in a lot of Wong Kar-wai's films, and he doesn't do much other than this kind of character in Wong Kar-wai films. So the reason I like him is I don't like him, but I like what he does for us. I think that's probably the way to put it. Not only is he sort of like charismatically comical, but he voices the sort of worst way of interpreting what Wong Kar-wai is doing with Maggie Cheung's character, Suli Jun. So she is beautiful, you know, she's wearing all these gorgeous dresses. She's clearly somebody people are going to pay attention to. And it kind of, the film gives voice to that through Ping. It also sort of gives voice to all of these desires that the characters like Joe may or may not have. And he is certainly not expressing because he's, you know, quite taciturn. And so it kind of, he's like this pressure release valve almost, where a lot of what is boiling under the surface for the other characters just is able to come out. And so I think that's a clever device for giving actual voice to a lot of those thoughts and feelings and perspectives without, while still preserving the sort of mystery of the main characters.
Thinking of pressure release valves, we have not a pressure cooker, but a rice cooker that I misread. And the heft and the feel of it, as well as the attention that's given to it. It seems to fit within a lot of what's going on with some of the props and the texturality of things that are being carried and brought with people. Thoughts on those in that moment, like what it signifies, or generally what people are bringing around in terms of modernity or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I love, you know, go back to Ping. I love the props. So good work, props designer. You know, there's something, there are a bunch of things going on. So I think you know, the basic level, the sort of texture of the world, and going back to the work scenes that you mentioned a couple minutes ago, like the typewriters, to something that both Maggie Cheung's character, Suli Jun, or Mrs. Chen, and Tony Leung's character, Mr. Zhou, have in common is they're working at typewriters. So she's a secretary, he's a journalist, but they have this kind of like parallel engagement with objects going on in their workplace. And similarly, you know, even the moving scene that we were talking about earlier sets up the way in which like the exchange or the misfire of exchange of objects is a theme that threads throughout the film. So in that moving scene, something that happens multiple times is the wrong object goes to the wrong apartment. So it's a piece of furniture, it's a pair of shoes, and the shoes recur later on in the film. I think it might even be that pair of shoes that shows up later. But this idea that there's sort of like objects and the ability to recognize objects as one's own or belonging to somebody else is actually an important clue throughout, because that's also how the two main characters, you know, spoiler alert, discover the affair that I'm sure we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. That the exchange of objects, the gifting of handbags and ties and scarves, is something that tracks affairs and love among people. And so you know, it's not just about texture and modernity and sort of, you know, identifying the class, the socioeconomic class of the characters or the moment in time, but actually how like the exchange of goods stands in for the exchange of other things in this film, you know, emotions among, primarily emotions, but also sort of like intention or relationship, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the gifts as remnants of a shared experience.
Yeah, or replacement of genuine affection in some cases, maybe.
We then Chell goes to get his wife at work, and very politely goes about this, delicately goes about doing some detective work, some gorgeous shots. There's a great one with an ovoid window or open space. And at this point, for me at least, I watched this movie with a bunch of people, and there are kind of two camps. There is the get out of the house, I'm going to yell at this movie, horror movie audience member. And then there's the other that just internalizes and takes it in and looks at it. Were you, which camp are you?
I mean, I love to look at this movie. I would pause it on certain shots and just stare at them, because I like that, but I think that it confounds a lot of our expectations for how film should move, through story, through time, through space. So, I like the darkness, I like the shadows, I like the sort of, what if we saw it today, we might think sort of overwrought framing. But again, this is like 20 years ago. So
Yeah. And we have the psychology of being cheated on, the doubting of your gut, all of that for me is told amazingly well and very efficiently around this point as it begins to swirl. And one moment where that becomes pretty clear is when Chan's at work and she gets Mr. Ho's wife a scarf, kind of this 9 to 5 moment. And it's a painful moment, the way it's written, and thinking about secondary lives and how things are in the workplace, but not necessarily at home. How did that kick out a topic that threads throughout the movie, but some gender roles and how they're recognized throughout?
yeah, I think that, I mean, I find it really interesting that Mrs. Chan's secondary relationship, as told through the film, is with her boss, not with her husband, because we never see him on screen. And so we see her interacting with Mr. Joe, and we see her interacting with her boss for the most part. She has a couple of exchanges with her husband, but on the phone or when he's off camera. And so the sort of idea of the way that her life is really conditioned by these subordinate relationships to the men in her life, her boss or her husband, and the way that it sets up this parallel between Mr. Ho's life, where he has a wife, she's constantly communicating with the wife, she's the one who's standing in for him, buying the gifts. So again, it's sort of this token of affection is not only standing in for Mr. Ho's lack of affection for his life, not even purchased by him. And we see that with a lot of the objects as they're sort of changing hands a number of times. And that through her working with him, she's very obviously aware. She's the one making the calls when he's going out with his mistress instead of going home to his wife. And so she's very keenly aware of exactly how this kind of deception is practiced, which she then discovers being practiced in her own life, and is probably, she doesn't seem particularly surprised when she discovers it. We actually get almost no emotional reaction in the process of her figuring out the affair. And then we then see her reenacting it as she does the sort of play acting scenes with Mr. Joe, Tony Leung's character. And so I think that that's kind of sets up this mirroring where in each version she plays a slightly different role and therefore is almost outside her own life in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about a little bit ago, the invisibility of the spouses, who I think were shot, and then when this film was wheedled down, because it was like a 2-hour film that gets cut to like a rough 90, they had scenes, and then they're given like a Norm's wife on Cheers like, effect. Is that effective for you? Do you like that absence?
Yeah, I do. What did you think of it?
I really dug it. Yeah, I think it is really, in part, it plays with not knowing. Part of we'll get into confusion over the roles that people are playing at various points, and it also there are moments where these body doubles where you assume that it could be our main characters, but it's the back of a spouse, or the unawareness of who they are allows the fluidity of the main characters to move into them all the more. I really like. I'm also a sucker for Norm's wife. Like, I like the unseen character, and when you play with it, and it's not like they had him running in with like a a turkey in front of their head, like
No, no, I know.
like a Thanksgiving episode.
I mean, that would have been a different film. But what I like so much about it, I think, is it allows us to imagine the affair, especially in the same way that the characters can imagine the affair. So, this sort of like piecing together what might have happened in a kind of shadowy offstage way, these ghostly presence. And also I think there's a sort of ghosting, in theater we talk about offstage as kind of like a haunting or a ghost, or there's a scholar named Andrew Sofer who calls it dark matter. That this, because it's not present, it actually seeps through more of the film than it would be if they were embodied more often. So if they were there, they would be characters and real and present when they're on screen, and less present when they're off screen. Because they're never really there, they're sort of always there. And I think that's very much how it is in the minds of our two protagonists.
As they now we're getting into moments when they miss each other and then meet, and one of the first ones is when they are going for soup with call it thermos, their pots there that they take it in, and we get a second world that's starting to develop with the city and the exteriors and alleyways. Does it read Hong Kong, because it is very, very tight? Again, we're not dealing with establishing shots. Does this feel like evocative of Hong Kong? Does it take people there, these moments, or do you think it's broader? How do you read that as they're getting to know or not know one another?
Ooh, I think that's a good question to ask the audience. I would love to know if anybody who's listening, seriously has spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, or was there back in the 60s or 70s. For me, I think it does something that that a lot of the film does, which it is the exterior city shots are incredibly detailed, but they're not incredibly specific. There are hints about, so for one example, on the wall next to the stairs down to the noodle stall, there are sometimes advertisements pasted. And so, if you read those and you look at the type of Chinese, it's in traditional characters, those sort of way it's printed looks like that era to me. Again, I wasn't alive in Hong Kong in the 1960s, but it seems sort of evocative of that. Similarly, the kind of street side noodle stall, especially when they're down and you actually get shots of like the chefs making the noodles, or when Tony Leung's character is actually eating there and you get the sort of like steam and shadowiness. It feels like it could be Hong Kong in the 1960s, but it also feels kind of like evocative of a Hong Kong movie from the 1960s. And so I think there's, and again, those shadows of Shanghai from the 1930s too. And so I think there's a way in which the detail actually creates this kind of like blurriness. We keep coming back to blurriness, this blurriness that allows you to both read it as very historically specific, but also kind of layer your own past memories, experiences, films you've seen from other eras onto that.
Which fits with a lot of, these are hazy memories are something that's being told in cinema for a long time, but especially around the turn of the century, we get a lot of these films that are specifically playing with hazy history and glimpses that can be, that's not nearly as direct as it might. There's not the persnickety showing of the past like there are in some other prestige pictures that kind of precede this moment. We have a really neat dinner between Zhao and Chan.
Dinner.
And where it really is, like you said, the dark matter of it, framed through the spouses and the shields that are put up from needing to be intimate. And a great whip pan. And talking about these, there are moments where, like a lot of the films that you find in these Sight and Sound polls, where film language is used, what uniquely makes this a film. And this is one of those these breaks where it's like, oh, we haven't seen this before, and just a return that someone's definitely directing this.
Mhm.
And after gingerly broking that conversation, we get one of the most amazing scenes in the history of movies. There is so much when they ask the question, I wonder how it started. And what are your big takeaways and how they play out this, how the affair might have started in this moment?
Oh, there's so much going on in the scene. I mean, really, like, where to start with it?
Well, as someone who does theater and self-awareness of theater and it playing itself, how does it speak to you?
I mean, I love meta theatricality. Again, like the slowness. Not everybody is a fan of it, but I mean, I think what's so brilliant about the way that this scene is affected is that the sort of hypothetical that I wonder how it might have happened goes immediately into a sort of physical embodiment of how it might have happened. And the stopping and the starting and the replaying, which they do each time they role play, allows us to imagine these sort of like multiple trajectories. And so there's this layering of sort of the what if questions applied to their spouses' affairs. And that's those same set of what if questions apply to their relationship. So, what if they actually did start having an affair? What if, she said yes to all the times he asked her to have noodles with him. There's the whole movie is suffused with these what if, and the conceit of role playing allows them to try out these different times. The other thing that I love about it is the way it establishes this contrast between the two characters in terms of their relationship to their spouses, because they're both being cheated on. We might be tempted to assume that they are in the same boat or experiencing the affairs in the same way. But what we see through this role playing is each time Maggie Chung's character is certain of how her husband would or wouldn't act, she corrects Tony Leung's character, whereas
She
he's
breaks scene. She just calls cut.
yeah, she's like, no, he wouldn't do it that way. And whereas he's much less confident, he's not sure how his wife would have acted. He seems like maybe he doesn't know her quite as well, or has more trouble with the play acting than she does, which also kind of maps then onto the fact that he seems to be the one who really does fall in love even more so than she does. She is slower to admit it anyway, because she already lives in this world where she's able to hypothesize and play act and has seen this play out with her boss. And, I think she's a little bit more aware of the kind of, how this thing might happen to begin with than he is.
Mhm.
I also think, so I have a theory, and I don't know if this is probably, on the internet somewhere already, and I just didn't find it, but I actually think that just before this, we see how it did start. So I think the scene where Joe's wife is crying in the shower, which is a couple scenes before this, and there's a knock at the door. I think the knock is Mr. Chan, not Mr.
That's a good read.
And the reason I think that, well, so I mean, it would make sense, but also because of the watch. So Tony Leung's character wears his watch on his right wrist, and it's like a thinner band. The hand that knocks is a left hand, and it's a thicker band with a round face. So anyway, I didn't check super carefully, but I think that it actually, like, the movie does give us a little hint of how it did started before we go into this like hypothetical scenario.
And that fits, I mean, it fits the structure in that it would be very willing to be elliptical.
Oh yeah, and there's nothing particularly linear about this.
No, that's a great gumshoe moment. Good work, Tarryn.
I don't know. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Some Uber fan out there probably knows for sure.
Right. And there's a lot for me as someone, who did has been on the inside of a community theater before. And just around theater, there's so often when art is used as an excuse to kindle a relationship that would otherwise be illicit, and then can be doused when the curtain comes down. Any stories from shows you've done or seen, or anything that comes to mind? Not you, just like, have you seen this around you?
I mean, I feel like given that these are recording, I should probably not out anybody's relationships on YouTube. But yes, I have seen people fall in love in the course of rehearsing plays before. And sometimes it works out. Sometimes it's not actually not just acting.
Yeah, it's yeah, it can cut either way. We then have another Lonely Hearts dinner as they start to develop, and this is the sharing of the mustard on the like seafoam plates, which I really liked. And at this point, my favorite dress comes on screen, and I don't know my flowers, but I think it's a daffodil, right?
I think so, yes.
I think so. A daffodil, large print. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and ask, of the dresses, what is your favorite look in the movie?
I love all of them. I actually briefly considered wearing a cheapao for this taping session, and then I decided maybe full cosplay wasn't quite the mood. But
In the mood for
my favorite
cosplay?
one. So she has one that recurs several times. That's sort of vertical stripes. It's gray and blue and kind of a maroon color, and it's in the one of the most iconic noodle stand scenes where she goes down for noodles and comes up, and just after she sort of exits the frame, Tony Leung's character comes and goes down. It's one of the first ones that's really slowed down and set to the instrumental background music.
Mhm.
So I like that one best, but I would be happy for any of those gorgeous dresses.
How many? I also think the closet space. I mean, the sheer volume of dresses in that tiny, tiny apartment, taking up a lot of room. Um, and as a storytelling device, they're interesting as they very clearly can mark moments that have changed, whereas Tony Leung's character is always looking the same.
Mhm.
Anything else that they're doing in terms of either mood setting or storytelling, or generally just objectification or not thereof of the character?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like to go back to the question you asked earlier about class, I do think so. We get not only the dresses, but several comments about how dressed up she is on a day-to-day basis. So to me, there's
There's
something about
hair, nails,
yeah, the hair, the nails,
figure. Hmm.
she's the other women, some of them wear the cheongsam or qipao also, but they're not the same sort of quality as hers. And so that plus the fact that her husband travels a lot for is clearly some sort of businessman suggests that there's like a little bit of a class difference between them and some of the other characters maybe, or that some part of her identity or her relationship with him is keeping up appearances in this way is somehow tied up in the character she's performing as his wife. um the other thing too is I think the dresses mark for us how significant the non-linearity of the storytelling is, because you never know for sure if the repetition of a dress indicates that the scene is the same day as a previous occurrence of the dress or just her wearing the dress again.
Hmm.
It's not clear at all, and it could be both. I haven't actually tracked the dresses, but I think that sort of signals for us just kind of how many possible ways of reading the film there are. You could, if you were to watch it and say she's just wearing the same dress on different days, you get a very different story than if you imagine that all the scenes in which she's wearing an identical dress occurred on the same date that she's wearing that dress.
And if you think of as we were talking about before, why the broad love for this film, you tend to find films that have permutation and repetition and things that allow for multiple viewings and reviewings and reconsiderations to be good as leftovers. And so I think that also is the reason people love the dresses, is because it is in many ways the keystone that allows you to set time and understand, oh, this is the one, this is the way that you're able to read and spoke out various iterations of a movie that's very interested in permutations. As they learn of the discussion or indiscretions are happening in Japan, the tryst there are these taxi cab scenes, again, just plopped in the back of a taxi cab. And we get a lot of moments of keeping up appearances. Is it, how, as a moment into the character psyche, which is wide open and deep, do you see it as legitimate fear, pleasure from the elaborate ruse? It's a bunch of things, but how do you see the keeping up appearances and the lack of consummation of the relationship at this point?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, certainly from, like a relatively conservative cultural perspective. And if not, like, if we don't read general culture into it, certainly the culture created by that particular apartment, because we know the ama and the landladies are watching all the time. And so, if nothing else, the gossip would affect their relationship with their landlords. For Maggie Chung's character, I I see it less as about like an elaborate ruse or legitimate fear, and more just she's extremely conscious of the way that appearances and performing your role are everything. And we talked about that already with how she's sort of better at the play acting or at directing the role playing than Tony Leung's character is. And
And
so for
self-directing. I mean,
yeah,
she
exactly. Like she's costuming herself, she's got the makeup and the hair, and I think like similar. So she's created this persona of Mrs. Chan for herself, and so it's certainly partly fear of the gossip, of the inappropriateness of getting kicked out of the apartment, of somebody telling her husband. But I think it's also she's very aware that she's constructed this role for herself, and that there will be problems if there are cracks in the role, if things
Mhm.
arise that show it to be a role as opposed to what allows everyone around her to believe that it is the real her. And we even, I think, see that in the way she introduces herself, because the character's name is Suli Jun. She appears in the other films as well, or at least she appears in the film before this and by name in the film after this. But in this film, she goes by Mrs. Chan pretty much exclusively. And so even that kind of idea that this is a character we've seen before, but by a different name, suggests this awareness of the construction of the proper wife, working wife kind of character on her part.
And as you start to see her open up, and him as well, and there's this boundary testing that is occurring, and it is a bit of a seesaw back and forth, and it seems like a very polite or timid like script like swingers will use like what do you think about this, like, do you wonder if you had never been married? And creating these imagined spaces that they might be able to leap or move into. And as they start and the way they begin to work together, and one way the relationship is able to move forward is through this martial arts serial that Tony Leung's character is writing, that to me feels very just like midlife crisis, like, okay, now it's time to write my book. But I'm curious, do you see a metatextuality as these two actors, Tony Leung and Maggie Chung, appear in films together? Or, for example, when you saw Hero, like, do you see In the Mood for Love as well? Do you tend to read celebrity for film, or do you let it bleed into other movies as well?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, they are so distinctive. And at this point in their career, it's hard not to see the actors, in the roles. they're kind of like, the way Meryl Streep is always Meryl Streep. But I think,
She can be a nun, she can be a prime minister. She's Meryl Streep.
well, and what is amazing about this kind of actor is that they can be both themselves and their character beautifully. Like, it doesn't impinge on their ability to play the character, that we still see them behind the roles. But I think that, like, for me, the more relevant, and for many Chinese or Hong Kong or Taiwanese viewers, like the sort of more obvious intertextuality here is so it's not only these actors moving among the films, but the way that there's also this intersection with martial arts films and novels and cinemas. And so, like, their engagement with the writing of this martial arts serial, sort of parallels the way that actors engage with the martial arts stories and making films, and the importance of martial arts to the Hong Kong film industry, and Wong Kar-wai's own previous engagement. And sort of before and after this, he would work in the genre of the martial arts film. And so it's kind of just like this, it's a genre that's everywhere, and everyone engages with it in some way. And so I think it makes sense kind of in the fabric of their lives. And also is maybe like a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference to, like, yes, we know we're gonna have to, like, play these characters sometime again.
Yeah.
So we may as well write them.
Yeah. We then have Suen and the Kus trapping them together when they're breaking parietals.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't get out that room.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very unspoken moment. This is a moment where feelings are not articulated, not even through hypotheticals or play acting or anything. The emotions that you felt from the two of them, sometimes they run parallel, sometimes they run perpendicular. When they're trapped in that room, did they, how did you see their characters in that situation?
I mean, I think this is another instance where they're experiencing it really differently, where you have, like, if it were the story from Tony Leung's Mr. Joe's perspective, there's probably some potential there because he's already starting to, feel an interest in this woman. And from her perspective, it's just a problem because she cannot be seen there, and it's a huge problem that it's her in his room, I think. And this kind of, again, it will break apart her persona, her character, if she's discovered to have, done this thing. And to go back to the gender question, this is also something where it certainly would have worse repercussions for her than it would for him. So what it means, it's bad for both of them if their landlords find out and landladies find out that something is going on or suspect that something is going on. But it's much, much worse for the woman if she appears to be doing something improper than for the man, I think, in this time and place. And so for her, I think it's more, sheer anxiety than the boredom of getting stuck there, and less a sort of like potentially sensuous experience, whereas his character might have been experiencing that moment as sort of, anxiety in the more thrilling or exhilarating kind of way.
Mm-hmm. And from there, they have they look for a new place to write in, and as I say, hurt people, and we get a lot of little paper cuts that, by the other side of things, are felt potentially with much more deep wounding. But we are at the ultimately hotel, and Chan begins covering for Joe, and there's small debts being put in each other's column. And a common trope in romances, either epics or rom-coms, is that once you're put in someone else's debt, whether in small forms like these, or, oh, you saved my life, now I love you, it brings you closer. Do you feel it's talking to romance film genre or literature directly, or how is it doing something that seems unique from the way we often have relationships build up and connect.
Yeah, well, I don't know. So do you think that this is a sort of romance or romantic comedy specific trope?
I no, I mean it's generally the way life works. In order for us to develop and care about one another and therefore have things happen, like I something will put us into contact. But there is the it's part of the gift giving phenomenon that you tend to find in romances. Like, I did this for you, now you will return this. And the miscommunication or misreading of them can lead to comedy or can lead to tragedy. Um, so no, I mean it's inherent to life, but the way it's used as a plot device for me felt like it very much similar to what we get in like rom-coms or whatnot. But there's something else going on along with it that gives it a very unique flavor.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it's something about here, the sort of the debts are, rather than bringing them together romantically, more about keeping them from outing each other um, to their spouses or to not that they're really doing anything wrong, but it's sort of keeping them connected enough that they're not going to jeopardize the particular type of relationship they've developed. And in fact, when it starts to move and, once they sort of admit that it's become an emotional affair, that's close to the end of it. Um, I was also thinking about the way just now in which the sort of debts that are most important between the two characters actually are the ones that they don't really perceive or know about. So I'm thinking in particular of when Mrs. Chan, Maggie Jung's character, makes the sesame broth for um, Tony Leung's character and just says she was making it anyway, but she found out he wanted it because he was sick from Ah Ping and did it specifically for him. But it's very important that he not understand the true nature of that particular debt. And similarly, there's a way in which like the whole the martial arts novel could be a midlife crisis, but he also knows she loves martial arts novels and he was kind of toying with the idea of writing it anyway. And so there's, I think, a way in which the novel, the first one anyway, is kind of for her
Mhm.
and sort of like a long serialized and very public love letter maybe but one that he would never admit to or she would never necessarily perceive as being for her and so like that actually that the debts are unacknowledged or unperceived, I think is maybe that's oddly enough where the closest connections lie.
Yeah, and that they by virtue of uh, the fact that they are meant to be camouflaged from people who be
Yeah.
seeing them, they can be camouflaged from the other party as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the hotel, we also get a room number 2460 or 24 2046, which is pretty conspicuous, and the name of the next film and the tetralogy. Uh, how do you break that down? What that might be bringing us to?
Yeah, so I mean, so I mentioned already the three films, and there are sort of four. So for viewers who might not have seen them all, the first one is Days of Being Wild or Afe Zhengzhuan, and then there's In the Mood for Love. 2046 is the third one, and then there's a fourth movie supposedly in the works, Blossoms, but that's been kind of filming had started but was paused due to the coronavirus outbreak. Now seems to be potentially starting again this month, and it is simultaneously a film and a mini series. So there's some question about what that's actually going to be. But yeah, so there are these previously three, now potentially four Hong Kong films as there or Shanghai films. Sometimes they're called his Shanghai films, I guess, actually, because they're all connected to Shanghai. So the 2046 in the third film, it's the title of the film. It refers sort of back to this room number from In the Mood for Love. In the next film, Tony Leung's character is writing another story that is sort of about a world called 2046, and it's this sci-fi story. And so one of the plot lines in the film is the sci-fi story playing out, but the other plot lines are about Tony Leung's character from In the Mood for Love, Mr. Joe, as he's kind of trying to recover from this affair that never happened. And so in that, the number 2046 recurs again as the room next to the apartment that he rents, or the room that he rents, and through that room cycle several women with whom he has different kinds of affairs. And so it's this kind of like layered intertextuality within Wong Kar-wai's movies, but it's also this reference to back to Hong Kong and its history. So 2046 being the year before Hong Kong's current system of governance will expire. So the current one country, two systems, probably don't have time to go into here, but the current sort of system of governance and the agreement.
You want to unpack that real quick?
With mainland China that preserves a lot of Hong Kong's rights to self-govern and local rule, which of course had been much in the news just before the coronavirus outbreak, because there were a number of huge protests last year and in preceding years as well. So this current status quo is set to expire in 2047. So 2046 marks the sort of like last moment before the world will change forever. And so this is something that scholars have called a kind of like anticipatory nostalgia. And in his films, it doesn't function like there's no 2046 Hong Kong that doesn't appear in the films, but the sort of reference to this moment after which all will be different kind of like projects that everything that's being experienced and filmed and felt now is going to be nostalgic and unreal and blurry in the same way that all of his storytelling in the films is eventually in the future.
Mm-hmm. And we get, thinking of his storytelling, we get a heavier hand in terms of his editing around this point in the hotel that is evoking some psychological realism at one point. And then we get a montage, as you often do when they're working together. And how did you see the relationship through montage, which is normally done without dialogue because, or with music, because you're trying to cut together a lot of things in order to cover a span of time without explanation. You let the image do the work. But it's interesting the way it's done through mirrors and how it's shot. How did that, what'd you pick up from there?
Well, I mean, I can't really imagine writing a martial arts serial any other way except by montage, because they're so long. You kind of need a montage to get yourself through it, right? Like, I wish I could write my current book manuscript by montage.
Yeah. Just flipping through the pages.
You know, like fast forward, writing furiously, typing furiously, and then it's done. No, but in all seriousness, you know, I think that it's another, you know, I think that a lot of the way he uses film style is referential. And so the sort of like fact that we don't get a lot of montage, but it exists in certain moments, you know, is kind of evoking other famous uses of montage. And in terms of, you know, the question of like how the bodies are being shot, the use of mirrors, you know, the way that Maggie Cheung's character is being portrayed like through this, I think you get this kind of like a move that he makes a lot, where you're conscious of her being objectified, but also conscious that you're doing it. And the mirror and the montage are a device that help with that, because it's so constructed in its filmic language that you can't be fully absorbed in it, you know, especially because we can say like, oh, montage is a technique that does X, Y, Z. When you watch it, you're more aware of the fact that the camera is intervening, and therefore like less able to unknowingly objectify. You're aware that that is something that the camera inherently does, and he's making you aware of by calling on the film technique as well as like the use of the mirrors and framing and things.
Mm-hmm. We then get plopped into another moment of play acting, and it's done in media res, like a lot of these. So you don't know who is being confronted or what the story might be. Does this scene work the same for you the way the previous one did, which you really dug, when they are pretending to confront or working through what that might be?
So it does, but what I like here is this is the sort of the moment where we start to see Mrs. Chan, Maggie Jung's character's control of the situation break down. So, she's really like, this really gets to her in a way that a lot of the previous play acting hadn't quite gotten to her. And so I think we see her thinking she's in control of the situation and then discovering that she's not. And I think maybe there's some suggestion that this is also the moment, like when her emotions erupt in this way, when she starts to realize that she also might have some feelings for Tony Leung's character, although that's not like definitely not explicit at all. It's just like we don't see a lot of emotion from her character, and we do here and then in a couple of subsequent moments, I think.
Well, and if she did let those emotions out, she's about to put them back in that box.
Oh yeah.
Because Suen upgrades her, your favorite character. So, and it doesn't take much for her to retreat. I mean, this is not, I mean, it might be a heavy-handed rebuke in its own way, but it's not, shut it down or I know what you're doing or things to layer it out. Like it didn't take much to push her to that. Is this the moment where Swen for a character? Is this why you don't like her?
Oh, why don't I like her? She just doesn't seem like she's as much fun as the Coos.
She's more
But yeah,
sober.
yeah,
Those Coos are pretty wet.
yes, this particular kind of like gendered policing by other women, I think is relatively realistic, but I don't like it. It doesn't make me like the character. That said, she's a great actress. Another Wong Kar-wai repeat actor. And I think that like if anything, what the sort of quick turn between the moments suggests is that Su Lee-jun is scared of her emotions like most of us are, right? Like the reason it doesn't take much for her to shut it down is because she starts to realize that it's something worth shutting down.
Mm-hmm. There is the announcement that he is going to be heading to Singapore. And it's interesting that we get the quote from him at that point that I've had enough of the gossip, when it seems that he's not the one who is doing he's not the beast of burden on that at all.
Nope.
But there is finally an awareness and announcement of the love at that point. And we get one last play acting when they look at how to end the affair, and closeness, clutching, weeping, and emotion. Do you this is the point I think when this could be rewritten, it could go a very different way. At this point, if you can get yourself in your mind of your first viewing or whatnot, did you see this viewing? Did you read this as a movie where it will not end together? Do you remember? Do you have that feeling to it? This is a good question for the audience too.
Yeah, I think it's a good question for first-time viewers. I mean, it seems easy now to say it's clear that this was not meant to be, but I've seen it many times at this point. So one of the reasons we return to it is because it's not meant to be.
Right. And then we get the Delilah radio show with the shout out, the happy birthday song over the radio, which it reinforces his presence, even though through distance and through this like modern mode, he's still there and enveloping the room through music, even though it's a pretty empty gesture in a lot of ways. Like getting a request on the radio is it's one of the sweetest things, but also one of the more empty things you could do. And here, the song that I I had it on my Winamp player after I watched this. I still have it on my computer. The Quizás, 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 where they go to the hotel room. And when she is in the room crying, not opening the door, is this the gravity of the movie? Is this the center moment for you, the way it is for many, or how did you take that moment in?
Yeah, I mean, like, definitely not light touched with the song, but absolutely. I mean, it's all about, the whole thing is about what ifs, and the question of how much of the story that we, I think by the end, come to feel is Tony Leung's character remembering even happened at all. This sort of, it's entirely about perhaps, and the I think in a lot of movies, and maybe if it were in either Cantonese or English, the song would be too much. It's sort of, it matters that it's not in one of the other languages that's spoken or sung in the film, that it's kind of this, what it means, but you can forgive it being a little bit heavy-handed.
Yeah. Yeah, and this, I mean, it's a film that, I mean, I think can support the weight of a heavy hand.
Yeah.
Because of the work that it's done
Yeah.
throughout the film.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's also one reason why it can hold this, because that's when 1962 ends. So that is a curtain falls, and so those strong moments can happen. We pop forward to Singapore in 1963. Again, moments of migration and movement, but we don't see people traveling. There's not the, I'm getting on the boat, I'm getting off the boat, here I am, everybody. We just plop in, and we get the secret sharing. Well, we get the story of the secret sharing, but we also get the secret being shared through the cigarette. Coming all that way to Singapore and leaving the faintest but most conspicuous of clues.
She also takes the shoes or the slippers.
And yeah, it takes the shoes. So yeah, both subtracting and adding to make sure, double down on no, I was here. But the way that plays then with the elliptical too, so you go back and see that she was indeed present. Mm-hmm. Did the scene play well for you, especially coming off of the unrequited hotel scene where she doesn't answer the door?
Yeah, so I go back and forth on whether we need anything after the previous scene, because I kind of I love that song so much. It's absolutely like that, and the underscoring for the noodle stand stairway scenes, like it's so iconic. Like why not end there on what if? And so I think what makes me a little bit more sympathetic to finishing out the movie in the way he does with the last few scenes is the idea that it becomes more and more conjecture and less real as we back away from the moment of 1962. So yes, we see that she's actually in his room, but is she? Right. So what he's got actually is a cigarette butt with some lipstick on it in a room that the landlord has access to, and some missing slippers, which the landlord could have stolen and said he didn't. So we don't actually know at this point if we are in imagination or not. Because we're also, so like 62, all of those scenes could be in memory of either of the characters. I think that by 63, we're not sure whose mind we're in anymore. And so that's a little bit redeeming for me, this kind of like, we're moving so far into the fogginess that we don't even know if it really happened. Like, did she or did he invent this story fully to justify a couple of weird things and his own ongoing obsession with this woman?
Mhm. Um, and that does also, in the very devastating scene where she's on the phone to the newspaper, it also makes you leave open, who was, you know, that could have been any call. Is that call occurring? Is this a call that she wanted to make and is playing out? Yeah, there's not a hard earth under it.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, even with the phone call, I don't think we know. Like, it's devastating, but I don't think we know for sure.
we then pop forward to Hong Kong, 1966, and that's the other thing. We get two very, and what you were talking about, like, oh, we didn't need anything more. It's nice that we just get a little dollop. We don't have that much.
They're very
Um,
short sequences.
and we have a reunion where Maggie Chung's character buys the Swen's old place, and Tony Leung's character attempts to reunite with Mr. Koo. Both feel like a bit of a pretense. And there's some talking, there's talk about migrating to the USA, and Swen doesn't want to do that. And with the line, that era has passed, nothing that belonged to it exists anymore. And I'm curious if that read for you as, a cultural statement, as well as, or just like a general moment in time statement, as well as how it might be for the characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a general statement. I think it's one of the moments in the film that reaches across to the contemporary audience, where it's more, it's like it's about that period being gone. It's about the current Hong Kong being gone someday. It's also about this sort of like, if the era that passed is the era of possibility, there are ways in which their lives and the lives of the characters around them have sort of foreclosed possibilities as time has gone on. So even just like the fact that she's got this kid means that something went forward with some other man other than Tony Leung. Maybe it was her husband, maybe they got divorced and she married again, we don't know. um, but just that sort of like things have become more concrete and less possible, as time has gone on for the characters, as it does for many people. And I think that's actually like one of the fulcrum points that connects to the final scenes, where we go like really into sort of like hard facts history as opposed to the
Yeah,
space.
well, let's hop with those. So, if we do get establishing shots in the movie, we get a very interesting one in the form of a newsreel.
Mhm.
And we skip in time to Cambodia, 1966, or skip parallel. Why are we getting a newsreel with Charles de Gaulle showing up in Cambodia?
I mean, so I honestly had forgotten that the newsreel was even there until I rewatched it this time. Like, I remember the secret whispering part, but I totally caught by surprise by the newsreel. So it's like, wait, did like my canopy do something weird and skip me to another movie?
March of Time newsreels just clipping in.
Yeah, it was just like a YouTube autoplay.
Yeah.
So I think, so like broadly, it's getting back to the sort of like reference that we talked about already, kind of in like the way that people are moving, and the fact that the world, so the world of the apartment that, or the apartments that Wong Kar-wai constructs, like his Hong Kong is very domestic and insular and sort of detailed, but not super specific. Like, it's a very small space in certain ways. But the world that he creates indirectly by association is huge. And it reminds us that these people who are living these very small lives are connected by transnational networks, and also to like what's going on during the Cold War throughout all of Asia, and that there are these parallels between colonial and post-colonial states, that what Hong Kong is going through is and will go through is some iteration of what a number of other places in Asia were going through in the 1960s. And so that sort of like reference to the Cold War as being something that was experienced, even if it wasn't showing up in the minutia of everyday life. The other thing too that, so I've read the way that like some people cynically read this as like a nod to Ken's by putting something French at the end of the film. That this is like trying to appeal to international audiences in a number of ways. So, like, first of all, specifically to the French by putting de Gaulle in there and like French Cambodia, but also more broadly by evoking something that is like very clearly Asian civilization. It's not Chinese, it's Cambodian, but this kind of like nod to the exotic ancient Asia that all foreigners imagine to be linked to any story about Asia, that there's something of that there. But what I actually think is that like some of that might be going on, but because he's so self-referential, like that's not, I wouldn't read that as just like cynical or even kind of like disparagingly self-exoticizing, but rather like a reference to the fact that he understands there are all these different frames with which you can see the film. And so like by placing it in this other way of looking at Asia, he's kind of like he's being referential, like self-referential about the fact that he knows the film when it goes to these festivals will be read like a kind of, Angkor Wat in a
Yeah.
way.
And when you have a film that is about hazy memory and rereading of history, to plop a prism at the end, where it's like, oh, now I'll quickly rethink everything through a different lens, is I mean, it's an effective trick. I mean, it's a good trick. I like it.
Sure, and like journalism equals martial arts fiction equals newsreels. There's some commentary there about how like all narrativization is fiction, maybe.
And then after that, we get the sharing of the secret, and then lingering shots of the Angkor Wat, and the final quote. Those remembers those vanished years, those looking through a dusty window pane that passes something he could not see, it could see but not touch. Excuse me. And everything he sees is blurred and indistinct. Again, as unique as that newsreel is, that ending shot and sequence, even though we can see when he's told the story about how you share secrets, you can imagine like, oh, this is how it's going to end. Did this wrap it up neatly for you?
I mean, there's a nice resonance.
Maybe effectively instead of neatly, because I think it purposely leaves a lot of things open.
Yeah. So I think there's a nice resonance between the opening quote and the closing quote, the sort of idea of like seeing but not touching. Because if we go back to that quote from the beginning, it's all about like this woman who wants to be touched, but he doesn't have the courage. And so if we pair that with this, he's saying he could see but not touch. So it's the same idea, sort of like proximity and not being able to, but here it feels more like he can't because of distance and time, as opposed to can't because of lack of courage, which is the case in the opening one. And so what I think is nice about it is it sort of like underscores not just the blurriness, but the sort of like possibilities of different interpretations of the same action, like as a failure to touch, lack because you don't have courage, so because you don't have the courage to remember things clearly or to acknowledge the way they really were, or is it this sort of like passing of time and blurring that occurs with all memory? I think that it lets us see the whole movie through those like two different interpretations. And again, one sort of like set out for us at the beginning where his failure is being not courageous enough, and one at the end where it's not a personal failure, it's because that's how time works.
Yeah.
And love works, maybe.
Yeah, and it's going to allow hundreds of articles to be launched out of it. So
many, and an hour and a half of conversation on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for unpacking that. It was so amazing to hear it through your own experience, like your frame of reference and your knowledge, because it really did add so much to my viewing, which I just redid. So thank you so much. And before you go, wondering if you would be game. So Proust had a younger sister named Becky. Have you read any of her work?
I am sadly thin in my Proust reading. Was educated and got a degree in East Asian studies, which doesn't involve a lot of Proust.
I don't know if Becky's work was ever translated. Becky's work may not have been translated, but she did develop a 5-question questionnaire to determine whether or not you love movies. Do you care to take it?
Sure.
Awesome. So, I need my social science glasses. This is very scientific. What was your first R-rated movie?
Okay, so you'd think that for like a teenager growing up in the Midwest, this would have been more of an event. I'm pretty sure it was the Blair Witch Project, which I don't even know if anybody knows what that is anymore. It was really a big deal when I saw it.
I taught it pretty recently, and there are people who are viewing it for the first time who don't know that, oh, I'm going to get motion sickness. And so it's not exactly in the ether as much as you'd expect.
I don't know what that says about me according to this survey.
Oh, well, I don't know. They're all interrelated. So the movie you would be compelled to buy, even though you may already own it, if you found a copy of it at Picker's Paradise for $2.
Okay, this one is definitely the Star Wars trilogy, preferably on VHS. I like Star Wars. It's not because I'm a huge fan. It's because I have these like really distinct memories of my dad talking about, nostalgically, with the theme of tonight's discussion, talking about like seeing Star Wars for the first time. And the first time I saw it was on VHS. And I think VHS is probably not going to exist for very much longer. So I kind of want like to have a copy of it for my kid by the time that VHS machines are being nostalgically reproduced for like the teens of 15 years from now for her to watch.
Right, and when it has its like record player moment.
Yeah, exactly.
It's vinyl.
Yes, when VHS becomes vinyl. You heard it here first.
The best movie to watch on a second date.
So this one, I have to offer the worst movie to watch on a second date instead of the best, because I have experience with worst movie for a second date. So and it probably wasn't actually our second, but pretty close to the beginning. I took my now husband to see Tsai Ming Liang's Face at the Harvard Film Archive when it was released, and he was there. So I thought it was cool. Like the filmmaker is coming. There's this new film we're gonna watch in 2009. Tsai Ming Liang is not a good date. Not a good choice unless you're really sure about the other person's taste in films. But he still watches the movie with me. Yeah, so
that's good. Well,
yeah.
I mean, it could have been, if it's some other movie, it could have been like a multi-hour like affair. So like,
oh yeah, no, it could have been worse, but it wasn't good.
Sub question to the next one. What is your favorite type of pizza?
Poblano pepper.
Okay. And the best movie to watch while eating that pizza on the couch?
Definitely something in the like DC Marvel verse. My tastes run towards like Wonder Woman, Black Panther end of that spectrum, but gotta have something
recent Marvel DC.
Oh yeah, recent Marvel with like some beer and some spicy pizza.
Got it.
Good night on the couch.
And then lastly, take yourself back to when you were 10 years old. You receive a screener from the future. What movie most blows your mind?
So here's where I think I lose all credibility that I might have gained in the previous hour and a half of this discussion when I say there's almost certainly Cats, the movie. So when I was 10, I loved musical theater. I still do. I mean, I study theater, I teach theater. I love a good musical. But at age 10, basically my exposure and therefore my love of the entire genre was limited to like Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals and Godspell, because that's what was on offer for a 10-year-old within the Midwest. I grew up in Ann Arbor, so, you know, we'd see like the touring productions in Detroit or the occasional New York trip to see my grandparents. And I played memory by memory on the piano for years and years and years. So I think if I had seen this like full on film adaptation, it would have blown my 10-year-old mind.
Have you seen it yet?
No, but last night I went down this rabbit hole of watching clips on YouTube, and so I think I've got to watch it this weekend.
Oh, you do. I think it's going to be a staple in the Finkelfunder series. Like, it's like our Christmas movie every year, so I think you'll have many chances to see it at some point.
I really love that this discussion started with Wong Kar-wai and one of the best films of this century, and ended with Cats.
And it ended with the best film of the century. So
to be determined. I haven't seen it yet.
Well, one second, let me review and calculate. Hey, turns out you love movies.
I do love movies. I'm glad
Questionnaire never lies. And we loved having you here on Zoom Back Camera. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about In the Mood for Love with us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thank you everyone out there listening. Have a great night, and we hope to see you here back at Zoom Back Camera very soon. Good night.
Bye.